why are we growing food in what look to me green deserts? No birds really, no insects. And I started to wonder, where is nature in all this growing of our food? Ancestral indigenous food systems that still are very much alive and that people do grow things in harmony with nature. But what we don't want to do is to give license for companies to be able to destroy nature elsewhere.
Hi, and welcome back to the Sustain, Change and Grow podcast, the podcast that shares ideas and inspires change for a better and more sustainable world for all. And I'm your host, Dilara Salahov. Today, I'm talking to an amazing woman, an entrepreneur, who was curious to ask questions about the way her supply products were produced. After digging deep into the problem, she found a new business opportunity and launched a company that benefits people, both consumers and producers, but also fosters nature and biodiversity. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how food can be good for you and for nature. Welcome, Marcela Flores. Great pleasure to have you.
Hello, Dilara. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Let us start with your story.
Sure. I am originally from Mexico, from a big city called Monterrey in the northeast of Mexico. And I've been living in the UK for a long, long time. And although I had always been an entrepreneur by nature, I had never really given myself the chance until the year 2008 came. And I was just missing food from home too much. And I thought it was ready. The UK was ready for some authentic Mexican food. And so I started my first proper business from my kitchen table. So I started making some salsas and some cooking sauces. And very soon I was being stocked in Harrods and Selfridges and Whole Foods, creating food from my own kitchen, obviously an accredited kitchen at the time. Then we moved to a purpose-built manufacturing site. And then after that, I outsourced manufacturing. So I have gone through the stages of accreditations and that type of thing. And at the time, I really enjoyed doing all that manufacturing and the selling and the distribution. And I learned so much about the food industry. But what made me the most interested was when I started integrating corn-based products into my product range that was being distributed in stores and in restaurants. I started to think about our food systems, and when I went to Mexico to select suppliers, and I realized that why are we growing food in what look to me green deserts? Just a monoculture of just corn, nothing else, no birds really, no insects, and I started to wonder, where is nature in all this growing of our foods? And so that was around 2010. And I started to dig deeper into other different food systems, into ancestral indigenous food systems that still are very much alive and that people do grow things in harmony with nature. And I started to really become very interested in what I now know is called agroecology or regenerative agriculture. And so I started to understand more about the importance of bringing nature into the way that we produce our food. And then when I exited my business, I joined different companies that were doing sustainability quite well, or at least from their marketing campaigns and all that type of thing. And I wanted to learn more about the subject. Until then, I realized that I really wanted to start my own business again. This time, integrating regenerative agriculture into everything we do. After having completed my master's in sustainability leadership.
Could you develop further what is the regenerative agriculture is? Maybe now
Sure.
just a couple of words and we will dig deeper because I imagine it's related directly to the Tierra Foods.
Yes, absolutely. So regenerative agriculture, it's a system that is very much context based, but the principles are always the same. It is about conserving nature and very much about restoring soils and restoring biodiversity, also improving water cycles, but very much also it is about how people are in more of harmony with the natural systems.
And what is the problem with the with these monoculture fields that you mentioned? Why we can't grow this way?
Yeah, so after the war, there were a lot of petrochemicals left that were not used for explosives and so on, and they were repurposed on. They found that actually putting some of those components into the ground made the soils more fertile, and they were used more and more, and without realizing that excessive use of those agrochemicals really destroy soils and destroy everything around that, because in soils that's where the microbiology starts, and we are a chain. When we destroy soils, we destroy ourselves. So monocultures are about how we can do more intensification in ways that most of the time damage both soils, damage nature, but also with all the inputs, they also damage people. So there's more and more understanding of really quite negative relationship between those pesticides and those chemicals and people's health and relationship with cancer and other serious diseases. So, although it served well as a green revolution, the use of pesticides had increased more and more and more, and that is the main problem.
So actually, indeed, the use of pesticides, but not only pesticides, but also the
Fertilizers.
fertilizers, right? This has increased the production like exponentially, starting from what 1960s, which also probably allowed to feed the growing population on the earth, but also leading to the environmental consequences that we are facing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the problem is that we continue to use more and more and more of. It's a bit like someone being on class A drugs. That first it's a little bit, but then using more and more and really becoming addicted to those chemicals. And now there are so many times more chemicals than they used to be before. And the problem is not only the soils, but they seep through to the water tables and to the rivers. And we see a lot of problems with how rivers are being polluted and are being full of algae because there is a lot of fertilizer into these rivers. And so the algae just blooms and it suffocates the fish, and it has many other negative repercussions, creating dead zones in the oceans as well, called eutrophication. So those are very, very serious problems that are affecting marine life and are affecting livelihoods of millions of fishermen and women, and and is affecting us too, because there are less fish in the sea. And so it is all like a knock-on effect. One thing affects another and then another, and because then we cannot grow the food with all those chemicals anymore. Then we're trying to put more and more rather than thinking, okay, let's stop and let's think about how can we integrate nature into what we are doing. And regenerative agriculture is really educating ourselves to do things differently with regards to growing food.
Yeah, so if I just kind of wrap up my understanding, so monocultures, it's essentially only one culture. And so because it's only one culture, there are, and in the nature, usually different species, they help to each other to fight insects, to fight diseases, etc. So they become more resistant to the whatever happens. So while in the monoculture fields, there is only one culture and it is very vulnerable So that's why it demands even more use of the pesticides to fight different uh, diseases and insects, but also demands more fertilizers to increase the soil quality, to increase the quality of the product, and increase the return on the seeds. Correct?
Yes, exactly. The problem is exactly what you say, is just choosing just one variety of one species. That's not how nature does things. Nature is all about diversification. It's all about having lots of different types of plants and animals that all have symbiotic relationships, or obviously predate on each other, but that keeps things in balance. But if we only have one type of plant, for example, in Ireland during the potato famine, there are, I don't know how many types of potatoes, around 2 to 3 thousand types of potatoes, but it was only one type that was being planted. And so when the blight damaged the crops, they damaged the whole lot. And we're seeing that with bananas, we're seeing that with some types of coffee, and so on. And so that's the thing, that we are choosing just one species, and that's to our own detriment as well. So really the key thing as to nature, the same thing is about diversifying what we put on the fields, and doing that in a way that those plants work well with each other. If one takes nitrogen, the other one gives nitrogen, seeking that balance.
One additional point, the production of the fertilizers is one of the most important, the greenhouse gas emissions, which is
Nitrous
the
oxides as well.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so they're very intensive in fossil fuels, and then it is very intensive in fossil fuel usage as well to spread them. And then there are other problems, not only with CO2, as you rightly say, Diliara, but it's also about putting those fertilizers or those pesticides onto the soil everywhere without any type of control. When it rains, for example, those go into the water, and then they evaporate into nitrous oxide, for example, and those greenhouse gases are very, very potent. So it is a combination of how they are produced, how they are applied, and then what happens afterwards. And then, as mentioned before, is also what happens to the water, what happens to the animals, because they don't only, if it's about a herbicide, they don't only kill one type of insect or plague, but it takes away the whole system with them. And we are seeing now, we are starting to understand how we depend on insects for our own survival. Have you heard of the windscreen effect? For
No.
example, even 15 years ago, if you were in a car for a drive in the evening, for example, you would have a lot of insects onto your windscreens. Do you have the same as before? Do you
uh,
see any difference?
that's a good question. I haven't paid attention.
Yeah,
uh,
well, especially at this time of year, right now is very early August. This is the time where there should be lots of insects out there. So if you go out and for a long drive somewhere which is a little bit more remote, you would have ended up with moths and sadly, splattered things into your windscreen or your lights. And now we have lost more than 90% of our insects, and so we don't have those problems anymore. And this is really quite serious. We have to revert that trend. We have to stop that trend that we are losing insects, because if insects go, many other foundational parts of our living systems do go too with them.
can you maybe spell out again why insects are important? Because I imagine for most people, insects is more like nuisance. It's something that bothers us, and we don't really appreciate the importance.
You're absolutely right. Even, I mean, me too. I'm trying to make friends with some of the insects that I'm not so fond of. But everything is related. So some insects that we might not like very much, spiders, for example. It is well known that when there is a lot of deforestation, for example, in tropical areas where there is malaria numbers have increased, and this is because there are less animals to predate on the mosquitoes, and there are lots of other reasons why, but it is about that relationship of spiders keep mosquitoes under control. Snakes, the same thing. The snakes keep rodents populations under control. And so if we don't have snakes, then we end up having more rats and having to put more poison and so on. And so everything is related. Most people are aware of the massively important role of bees as pollinators. They make sure that we grow our crops of fruits and vegetables. Most of our crops that we eat depend on those activities of pollinators, not only bees, but there are many other animals that do that too.
What is your level of concern about the climate change and the environmental problems that we are facing? Like from 0 to 10, where would you place yourself?
That's a really tricky question because I try not to live in the worry space, but if I allowed myself to live in that space, I would say that it's a 9.5. There are a number of systems that are showing that are really in quite red alert, from sea to fields and soils, and of course the strange weather that we are having all over the world right now. But I am an optimist, and there are so many examples that we as human beings, if we make our mind and together want to solve something, we can solve it. But the key thing is to have that resolve and to have that joint action. Something that gives me a lot of hope, for example, if how the concerted effort to eliminate those CFCs in the 80s, and how when everybody came together, they all knew that the ozone layer was getting bigger and bigger, and it only took that concerted effort that everybody pointed in the same direction. With climate change, I think it is much more complex than that. And I wonder what is the point that those who don't believe or don't want to are in this kind of sense of closing their eyes and their ears and in denial, really, what is going to take for them to realize that their lives are at stake, and so are the children, their own children, or their own, if they don't have any children, their neighbors or their cousins or whoever it is. What is it going to take? I'm not pessimist, I'm an optimist, and I think it is from a grounded place where we have resolve, we can solve things like, for example, desertification. This is something that we're starting to work on with Tierra Foods, and we're basing ourselves on science and on evidence on how, when we restore nature, when we farm together with nature, for example, with the agroforestry system, so mixing forest trees with crops, so to create a crop system that mixes trees and food. With those agroforestry systems, we have seen all over the world that they can reverse biodiversity loss, and they can even create microclimate. Diliara, this is just so fascinating. I've heard this saying, rain doesn't make trees, trees make rain. If we stop for a minute and think, oh, well, I thought that we needed rain for a tree to grow, but yes, of course, that's the case. But it's also the case that when we restore at scale, we create microclimate. Of course, it needs to be the right tree in the right place. We can't just put bamboo in the tropics or somewhere like that. We need to educate ourselves on what trees and what systems are right for those contexts. So we have to use native species and replicate nature, and that can have such a powerful effect. And that's what we are doing.
Very nice transition to talk about Tierra Foods, what exactly you're doing.
Yeah, so agroforestry systems combine trees, perennials, and annuals to produce food in systems that are so much more effective in restoring biodiversity, restoring soils, and also they are more productive because the growers are not having all their eggs in one basket. So they have production, if they are well planned, production all for almost all the year. Whereby, for example, if you're just harvesting corn, you have just one crop and that's it. And so agroforestry systems, what the ones that we are creating, we are understanding from the health of the soil what are the right conditions for the soil to thrive with our own systems. So we use a keystone species that is that exists all over Central America and South America, and also a little bit of North America. So that keystone species is a very special tree that when it absorbs carbon, it of course it does what every tree does, creates biomass. It creates biomass, uh, growing its trunks and its leaves and so on, but it also absorbs carbon and mineralizes it into the ground, into deposits of calcium carbonate. So in other words, some of the carbon that it absorbs, it stores into the ground for 10,000 times more than biomass can last, for example. So we have this situation where there's this permanent carbon being absorbed, and so we want to replicate those systems in areas where they would have existed. And so that's what we do. We combine these trees that also produce edible seeds, and so we're creating the market for these seeds in different ways, in flours for baking, tortillas, bread, cookies, delicious brownies, things like that, but also they can be turned into a really delicious, very good for you coffee, high in tryptophan, which is an amino acid that makes you feel good. And they're high in protein and fiber as well. So it's a very interesting type of seed. And then the leaves are wonderful for humans, but they're also great for animals. For example, cows, monkeys, or animals, herbivores love the leaves and they're very, very healthy. And so those trees are our keystone species. And then,
Sorry,
according to the context, we develop different systems to go with them.
so
Sorry.
keystone species, that's the name of the tree?
No, the keystone species is the main species that then other species live around it, so to speak. The tree is called Brosimum Alicastrum. That's what
Okay,
it's
so
called.
you planted these trees and you created the ecosystem. You also plant other
That's right.
species around it. So you
Yeah.
create, like, basically you reforest.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly. So we are reforesting using that main species, and depending on where we are, so in some areas there are some plants that lend themselves to be planted in those areas, and then in other areas there are other plants that are happier there, depending on the height, depending on the altitude of sea level, depending on the temperature, depending on pH and different things. So we are understanding what is the ideal agroforestry system for our trees. And then the other thing that we're developing is a methodology and a protocol to measure, to monitor, and to report those impacts. Of course, climate impact, carbon absorption, but also biodiversity net gains and social impact. So through our monitoring, reporting, and verification methodologies, or MRV, that's how they are mostly known, we are also helping consumer packaged good companies to inset their emissions. So in other words, if consumer packaged good company, a large global food company has set climate targets, science-based targets, the best way to address those targets and to get to their net zero goals and hopefully net positive. The best way to do that is inside their supply chains. So this is what we're helping them to do, to act inside their supply chain. So by adopting our agroforestry systems, we provide them with the measurements and with the data, and so they can act inside their supply chains. Because let's not forget that for a company, for example, say Nestle, more than 90% of their emissions are inside their scope 3, in other words, inside their supply chains. So this is where they really have to act, and buying offsets that have nothing to do with their supply chains is only kicking the can down the road. So it is about acting inside your own supply chains, and this is what we are doing.
The income for your company comes from selling the product so that you produce.
Yes, so we do different things. We sell the products
So
in
this is the
partnership.
flour, right? So that
Yes,
for the food industry.
that's right, yeah. But we also create the systems that also can also be monetized, and also the insets can also be monetized. So we are not there yet because we are developing those monitoring systems right now. But from 2024, we are going to be able to monetize those carbon insets as well.
So when you say carbon insets, is it like carbon credits?
Yes, but the difference here is that you are acting inside your supply chain. So you are not saying, okay, well, I am producing some wheat based products. My wheat is a monoculture, is killing nature. So I'm going to carry on like this, but I'm going to buy offsets from somewhere else growing bamboo in in some, for example, or eucalyptus, or some other forestation things. So we're saying, okay, so your supply chain has some problems. Let's work on this together so that we can address that and be nature positive and be climate positive and carbon negative. So we can absorb more carbon than what we are using. So we are acting inside supply chains.
Okay, so insets relatively to carbon offsets, it's essentially.
Inside your supply chains. Mhm.
I haven't heard yet about the biodiversity credits. Is there anything like this?
So we are not working on that just yet. That could be something for the future. But what we don't want to do is to give license for companies to be able to destroy nature elsewhere and to just buy our nature credits so that they are able to deforest elsewhere. We want to invite companies to be nature positive and to restore rainforest. Of course, retaining and conserving is really, really important. And this is why we are also working with living forests, with indigenous people who can capture those seeds from living forests. And this is so, so important. Make sure that we bring that bioeconomy to life. In other words, there are many people, around 5% of the population, of the human population, look after around 80% of our natural capital. But those people, indigenous people, local people from forests, need to make a better living from living forests. And this is the activities that we are doing by using wild foraged seeds. But at the same time, we believe that it's also important to restore. There are so many million hectares in Latin America alone. For example, there are 650 million hectares of deforested and degraded land. And out of that, around 20 to 25% are suitable for our systems. So, what if we can also restore 6.5 million hectares with our systems and help kick the biodiversity into life again through forest products?
And it's very important that you mention the people, and I imagine you also care about the fair salaries to make sure that farmers, the people who do take care physically of the forest, they get fair salaries. Because we know that from the product, for example, chocolate, farmers get only something like 6% of the total price that consumers pay, and the rest is lost somewhere along the supply chain.
In many cases they have never even tried chocolate, for example. They make something but it's so alien to what they are eating. For us that's a really really important point, both from the food security and food sovereignty perspective, so that people can actually feed themselves and they are not depending on grains that they have to buy, because those grains are barren and they won't yield any plants in the future. But also from the perspective of decent work, and work that they are proud to do and that they can be skilled and to promote from inside the company, from those people who are the foundational part of our food systems. They know best, they are part of those systems, and we learn a lot from them, but they also learn from those systems, and it is a really great relationship. That's really important to us.
And in Tierra Foods, so you're working also with indigenous people. The other question, so these seeds and the use of these trees, is it also part of the knowledge of the indigenous people?
Yes, definitely. Not everyone that we're working with has eaten them in the past. It's very interesting this question, because it seems that in some areas, for example, there was this lady that I interviewed, and she was saying how she's a Mayan lady, so Spanish in Mexico. I interviewed her in Mexico, and Spanish was certainly her second language. Mayan was her first language. And she was telling me how her grandma used to tell her that when her grandma was a little girl, that there were times that there were famines and there was nothing to eat other than those seeds, and that kept them going. And they are really highly nutritious. They have protein and starch and fiber and lots of different multivitamins and minerals. But they kind of associated those seeds with sadness and poverty and humiliation. And so they actually did not continue to eat them afterwards. And also with the maize and the green revolution coming more strongly, then those seeds came to be less consumed in that particular area. Not to say that, of course, they'd always eaten maize, but maize is not available all year round, and it works well when maize is available. Sometimes those seeds are not, and so on. And so that's about like food sovereignty, what, seasonality. But in other areas in Mexico, people told me, oh, yes, we used to combine them with maize and boil them together and make delicious tortillas and so on. And that was the idea to give us to work with one of the largest bakery companies in the world to start to integrate those seeds into their tortillas, for example, which is a huge staple in Mexico. So we're working on growing that, and that came from an idea from one of the indigenous ladies that told us. That's an anecdote. The sap of the tree, they used to take it, and the mothers who were lactating, to be able to breastfeed their babies better, they used to drink that, and that helped them, for example. So that's not a medicinal thing that has been proven or anything like that. It's just anecdotal, but I wouldn't be surprised that there are some superpowers there that to be discovered.
And are you working directly with the academics or research institutes to discover and document these qualities?
We are currently working with academics to discover more about the climate impact and the impact on soils of these trees, and also to understand which trees are the best, because there's lots of different types of varieties and so on. So we're working on that, natural selection. We're currently not researching those medicinal anecdotes that I was mentioning, but it would be so fascinating to do that in the near future. It would be so fascinating.
And what about these big companies, food producing companies? Are they interested in your product? How is the take?
There are, I'd say, two different types of companies that we talk to. One of them are the smaller ones that are interested because it's got an amazing social story. It's got an amazing opportunity to say we are restoring nature, we are restoring forests with these trees. They really like that opportunity to talk about social impact and biodiversity impact, but they don't have climate targets. So that's one company or one type of company. Another one is the type of company that has set their net zero targets and that they clearly haven't got that much of a roadmap of how they're going to be fulfilled. But they're starting to wake up to the fact that they need to act inside their supply chains. And so for this kind of company, we provide a really complete solution because, as well as the story for the marketeers and as well as the interesting, innovative ingredient for the product developers and the research and development, we also provide that accurate data. And, we've all heard in the news or read on the papers about some of those carbon projects that have fallen into disrepute and how people are thinking, oh, well, clearly carbon credits are failing us all. Now we have to be careful to think that because there are some problems. Yes, there are some problems, and it is important to report and to uncover them, but it's essential to learn from those and to improve, not to just completely
Throw
ourselves
the
from that
baby with the
system.
water.
Exactly, exactly. Because even for the best well meaning companies, that is part of the transition. We have to, as responsible suppliers and as consumers as well, continue the pressure and to understand whether these companies are being sincere or are they just entertaining with carbon credits and so on. But carbon credits are an essential part of the transition because whilst we organize ourselves to be able to be fully carbon negative and absorbing more carbon than what we emit in our supply chains. Once we get to that point, paying for carbon credits can be a really, really important part of the journey. And also, let's not forget that sometimes maybe a fire destroyed the forest and so on, but it provided jobs, it provided lots of other co-benefits.
Just for the audience, maybe you can say in a couple of words what science-based targets are and why companies have to set it up.
Science-based targets is a system that companies can declare what they are going to be doing to achieve net zero by any time that they so choose. Some companies say 2039, 2040, 2030, depends on the company itself. And these targets need to be based on scientific evidence and on methodologies that are recognized around the world. And because all these are new systems, we've never had to do this ever before. So all these things are new. Yes, it all started in over 20 years ago, and I understand that we have had chance to learn, but we are continuing to see the how we need to act more and more urgently and more quickly, and these are more widespread than ever before. So as we learn, yes, we are likely to make some mistakes, but we need to learn from those mistakes and perfect the system. And so the science-based targets are there to help to put more rigor into the activities that the supply chains are doing for food systems, for a fashion industry, for lots of other materials and consumables, and also software and service companies, not only what we physically consume, but other activities are also hugely emitting, even if we don't have a physical product.
Yes, indeed. So actually, in Europe, it's 2050. European Union set up as a target for achieving carbon neutrality. Other countries set up their targets around this range, 2060, 2055. It varies. But as the governments have to make efforts to reduce carbon emissions of the countries, so should do the companies as well. So, and as you say, companies to do this and to do it rigorously and scientifically, they set up the science-based targets, which is I believe, part of the United Nations initiative. So it's officially recognized standard how to do it scientific way. But of course, we have to learn on the way how to do it because this is something new that the humanity has to do, and we have never done it before.
No, exactly. And we are learning as we go. And yes, we are likely to make some mistakes. I think the issue here is about transparency, and when mistakes are made, then I think consumers want to understand what the learnings are, how we're going to be rectifying those as responsible producers, our responsible companies, and I think there are some lessons there in terms of continuing to communicate in effective ways without trying to do greenwashing or purpose washing. And the important thing is also to act, because we have seen a backlash where companies say, oh no, it's too scary to have any action at all because it might backfire, and they might accuse us of wrongdoing, in which case it's best not to do anything. What the world really needs right now is for people to take imperfect action rather than no action at all. Because as we take imperfect action, so long as we learn and so long as we improve, this is exactly how we learn any other skill. We were not born learning knowing how to walk or how to ride a bike or etc. So we have to sometimes fall and we have to pick ourselves up, and it is about that integrity of what needs to be done ahead, but action needs to be taken.
And this is a good point you're saying that it's integrity and it is the purpose-driven actions. Yes, we may make mistakes, but if our objective is to reach carbon neutrality at every level, the right actions, even if we fail because we learned it was not the right path, but just not to be confused with actions which were taken for the wrong purpose. So, like, to cover up kind of actions, we do something, well, we keep failing, but because behind the purpose is not the right one. It's really like what you mentioned, the greenwashing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the key thing is to really act from the main business activity. We've all seen how, oh, my company does some beach walks and beach cleans or something. Well, if you're not a tourism company, then or something very much related to beach cleans, then you need to do something that is actually related to your own main day business activity. So, for example, banks, yes, it's great if they take their staff every year to volunteer and paint schools in Africa, or if they volunteer and have their staff to plant trees or something. That's wonderful. But what banks need to do is to stop subsidizing and paying for fossil fuels to continue to be extracted from the ground. So that's exactly what they need to do. They need to be responsible and to support those activities financially that have a net positive effect on the climate, not about distraction of, oh yes, we're continuing to pay for all these fossil fuels, but it looks really good that I'm running this entrepreneurial climate action thing. Well, great that you're running an entrepreneurial climate action program, but really, before you do that, you have to look inside your bonnet, inside your supply chains, or inside your business models and change them first. So that's what we need to do.
And with respect to this, a question. So you had, several years of experience in the companies, in in corporate world, which you mentioned in the introduction, saying which looked good in the marketing. So how was the true experience? Did they really walk their talk?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, huge corporates, small companies, all companies are made of humans. Some people are more sincere than others. Some people care more than others. I do believe that the companies where I was working, they really did try to make the world a better place. So I think that intentionality and purpose is really, really important. But if you think that you're on the sea on a boat, if you are in a little tiny boat, if you move, you can move very quickly and turn 45 degrees. But if you're on a big, huge cruise or in an enormous yacht, or if you move 3 degrees, it's going to take much more energy and it's going to be harder, but you end up in a different direction altogether. This is what I saw in some of the companies where I worked. The change was slow and progressive because it was impossible to make huge change overnight and bring thousands of people or tens of thousands of people into change, because it depends on very complex supply chains, and it also about customer demand and obviously profitability. And what I learned there as well in the first company where I worked is the power of all stakeholders. For example, the investors. That company in particular was in danger of being taken over by another company. And it was because some of their investors wanted to see more internal profit. Is that kind of tension of those investors and generating value for the short term versus the long term. And this is a tension that particularly public companies have. But I have also learned very clearly that any investor in a company needs to be fully aligned with the overall impact purpose of company and the entrepreneur. Otherwise, it can debunk its progress.
So the question of sustainable finance and more financial institutions following the sustainable finance principles is really accurate.
Oh my goodness, it's so crucial because finance is a huge lever for change, right? We can do all the changing that we want to, but if we don't have the finances to be able to make those changes, then very little is really going to move. And this has been one of the challenges for regenerative agriculture, that there has been this perception that regenerative agriculture is less profitable, that it is more risky, that people don't necessarily know how to do it, that the transformation is going to be expensive for farmers. Now, there is a lot of evidence now to show that actually it's not more expensive in the long term because you're saving on inputs. You're saving a lot of money in those petrochemicals that we talked about earlier on. But the transition does take time. So what happens in those 2 to 3 years where the farmer is producing less because it's healing its soil? The soil is going to be better and more productive in the medium term, but in the short term, it's like a drug addict really that needs that drug to be able to continue to function. And so whilst that healing of the soil is happening, there needs to be some kind of level of other types of finances coming in. And this is why we're starting to learn around the world how important that term of blended finance is becoming, and those partnerships between private and public, the non-profits and the large NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, how we need to galvanize to bring the right types of finance for the right solutions, and how we must stop subsidizing those systems that are killing our planet and are killing ourselves. Because was it last year, Dilara, that there was over 1 trillion of US dollars gone into the wrong types of subsidies? And so those, how can you compete if you are competing against a system that is very heavily subsidized? Of course, it's going to be more expensive. So we need to even up the playing fields.
And have you seen positive and encouraging examples of the blended finance at work?
I think that there are a lot of organizations now that are moving the finances in the right direction. And I can see now that, for example, even things that were pledged in COP26 in Glasgow, where there was going to be net forest positive subsidies or payments for the indigenous people and so on, I can start to see now, almost 2 years after that, those commitments are started to trickle down to the right recipients. I can start to see that. That is for sure. I don't think it's only my echo chamber and that I am just surrounded by people who care about these things. I think that governments are starting to mobilize funding, whether it is at the right speed and whether it is at the right magnitude that we need, that is open to debate. In my view, we need to be doing more and we need to do it faster. It's like that ship analogy that we discussed earlier on. It is moving slowly in the right direction, but there are lots of other counter movements that are trying to knock that off balance as well.
It's a huge system, and it's, though relatively recent, maybe 60, 80 years, but still the way we function, it's built in our how to say, in our minds. We think that's the way the world works, right? So it takes a time changing habits at the individual level, but also even more effort to change things at the governmental level, given all the lobbies and the financial interests of different
Yeah.
corporations, which would benefit from the system we have currently.
Yes, absolutely. And change is very complex to effect because there are winners and there are short-term losers. But this is where I think that communication with optimism and with opportunity, and looking at not only an example, for example, in Texas, and the oil industry, for example, there. What if we communicated in a way that to say to those people who hold very deep interests that that how the transition can look like for them, to benefit their families, that there are no job losses. Instead, there is retraining. There are opportunities for higher earnings because the future can be very bright green if we provide those right transition opportunities. And you mentioned something really interesting here, which is around individual action. And of course, as consumers, we vote with our wallets. I'm sure you're aware that it was, I don't know, a decade ago or more, that some of the fossil fuel companies were subsidizing PR campaigns on your individual carbon footprint. So it's like, no, it's nothing to do with me, and extracting all those billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is to you. You are not doing the right thing, or it's up to you, your responsibility. Why are you driving a car? You should walk everywhere, or something like that. So I think it is, we knew since the 70s, these people, these corporations knew from the 70s that they were doing was changing the climate, and they chose not to listen to those scientific experts, and they chose to continue and instead put the onus on the consumer. And whilst we consumers have an important role to play, it is much more on the corporate level that's where the real action happens, right?
It's called also triangle of inaction, right? So pointing every actor, governments, corporations, and consumers pointing to the other for the first one to start acting. Well, the truth is that the system, the problem is so complex that everybody should start acting, and right now. And I think that is part of the responsibility of every one of us to do things. There is a publication in the Nature using the proprietary data of ExxonMobil. The scientists showed that the correlation or the relationship and projections until something like 2050 of the carbon dioxide emissions and the temperature increase. And then recently, the scientists put over lines of how it happened in reality, and the two lines coincide almost perfectly. So, but then these companies, they instead decided investing a lot of money into doubting the climate change, into what you said, it's up to consumers to act, etc. So, yeah, but I would say that it's always easier to say the others should act, but we always should start with ourselves. That's what I believe.
Yeah, and then change inspires more change. If we go back to the regenerative agriculture example, farmers are always looking at what the other farmer is doing. They learn from each other very actively. And so, if one starts to change and produces more food, more profits, and so on, then the other ones may be tempted to think, okay, well, these people are doing well, so why don't we try this ourselves? But it needs to have that kind of first brave initiative, brave backer, and so on. And the challenge is that right now with investors, for example, a lot of the changes that are required at scale are not suited for traditional VC models. So VCs are used to more venture capitalists, and private equity are used to business models that are more software based, less infrastructure, less deep tech, and so on. And so a lot of the funds required are not suitable. They will not come from this type of investors. So also as entrepreneurs, we need to be aware. We need to look for different types of finance.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the advantage of this high tech investments was that it was a very quick return. So it's just a couple of years, and you could see the income coming. But with your type of business or other sustainable businesses, it's a lot of investments, and it takes time. As you said, it's like 3 years just for the soil to recover before producing any yield. And this is a much longer vision, which probably financial institutions have forgotten, right? And the venture capitalists forgotten as well, because there was this easy money with the more high-tech industries.
That's right. And let's also remember how finances must serve life and finances must serve people. That what Milton Friedman said about the business of business is business. We have seen the results of this, and it has created a huge amount of social injustice, and how our business models need to look into that too, because VC models tend to be very much about that pyramid of only very few benefit, winner takes all, and then what happens to the rest. And so it is we need to be thinking of more distributed benefits to more stakeholders, not only to the ones who provided the funding.
How is it to be a female entrepreneur? I think this is something still pretty new, and most entrepreneurs are male. How do you feel in this community?
I guess I was brought up to be thinking of myself as a person more than as a woman. Or so when I started with my first business, I was perhaps naively thinking that it doesn't matter, we can create something exciting, and the right type of funding can come, and so on. But having looked at the stats, 2% of VC funding goes to female entrepreneurs. If we measure that against how many female entrepreneurs there are to start with, I'm not so sure whether the stats are quite as bad. I really don't know. But those are pretty stark numbers anyway. And so, yes, it is difficult to raise finances. I tend to agree with what was mentioned earlier on about how we perhaps think more long term, or certainly I am thinking more long term. Perhaps some of this thinking is not so in line with some of the VC models. But I've learned to also talk to the right investors rather than perhaps think that everybody is going to be the same. So I think there needs to be some level of literacy from the entrepreneur to understand what are the investment thesis from the organization, and do as much as we can, and do a really good job. And yes, some people say that need to prepare twice as hard, you need to try twice as many calls and so on, but we are getting some traction. I think that with a little bit of good fair wind, we are getting the right funding that we need.
And what would you recommend to people, and especially women who would like to start their business?
Well, when I started, I was feeling quite like an imposter, and it took me to write a master's thesis, and to have a lot of preparation. But sometimes that imposter syndrome is in vain, and sometimes is there for a reason. And so try to address and be the best you can be, and then don't doubt yourself. Yes, it's impossible to be liked by everyone, but once you feel that you have done your homework, and that you know what you're doing, and you have your market research and so on, go for it, and surround yourself with people who can support and provide that high level advice as well. I think that mentors and coaches are really, really important part of this journey, because we all stand on shoulders of other giants. But I think that there is a level of thinking, okay, no more doubting, let's go for it, and go with confidence.
What is your two most inspiring books?
I love a book called Wilding by Isabella Tree, and that has taught me a lot about the power of nature. It's taught me a lot about what happens when we let nature be. But also the follow-up from that book is they also have started some regenerative agriculture. So I followed the NEP project here in the UK quite closely. So it's called Wilding by Isabella Tree. I absolutely love that. And then there is another book that I really like that is a business book, and is a high classic. It's called From Good to Great from Jim Collins. And it encapsulates that, what he calls Stockdale paradox. So it's like really looking at what's happening in the present, and don't delude yourself. So you're looking at a problem that's not so nice and needs to be solved and so on, but at the same time holding that vision. And so how do you deal with those two very different realities? What's in your mind versus what's in front of you? So I find that really challenging, and that I really like that. Good to Great from Jim Collins.
Thank you very much for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you
wish
very
you all
much.
the best.
It's been a pleasure.
I very much enjoyed the conversation with Marcela. Indeed, food constitutes the most intimate relationship between us and nature. The current food system just put all nature laws upside down. The amount of pesticides and fertilizers used is terrifying. Animals are fed by products they're never supposed to eat in the first place, including hormones, antibiotics, and other chemicals. We can see all the negative effects of such a food system on nature, and we can just imagine what effect this unnatural food has on our own health. There are certainly ways of doing things differently, but many stars have to align to change the wrong path we have undertaken. Introduce subsidies for actions that respect nature, change investment objectives, and support and encourage such entrepreneurs as Marcela. The positive side is that solutions exist, they're feasible, and they will really benefit both humans and nature. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it inspiring. With any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email me at scgrowpodcast in one word @gmail.com. Until next episode, stay green, stay inspired. Bye bye.